Hello, everyone. I'm Lukas. I'm going to introduce the speakers for the tutorial part of the adaptive, degenerate, and yet comparable, rethinking representational comparisons. And for this tutorial, we'll have Lukas Braun, who is a research scientist at Allen Institute, Marvin Theiss, who's a PhD student at Tübingen, and Eleanor Holton, who is a postdoc at Princeton currently and incoming professor at Columbia. So please welcome them.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to our tutorial. We have our tutorial hosted on this homepage. It's not a collab, it will just run on your laptop. The format of this is going to be that we'll have like some presentations, we'll have some slides, and then we have interactive figures. So there's not a lot of coding you'll have to do, but we'll really try to shape your intuitions around like why representations and functions are separable, what does that mean for representational comparisons. And yeah, that will be kind of guiding you back and forth between slides and those interactive figures. So it's separated in 3 parts. Each of them will take around 30 minutes. The first one I'll do, it's mostly on linear networks, and we'll establish with literally the most, if you know multiplication, you will be able to follow along what we're doing here, so even if you don't have the deepest theory background. And so we'll show how function representation are dissociable in linear networks. And then the second part by Marvin, we will extend this line of thinking to nonlinear networks. And then in the last part, Ellie will take us to a network simulation of a human experiment, and we'll investigate how different representations we can find by keeping some data out and like querying the participants to figure out what kind of representation they're using. Okay, so here's the URL under which you should see this view, and it should lead you to here. And if you scroll down a bit, we have the 3 different tutorials, and we'll start with the one that is linear networks. If you open this, it might take like 10, 15 seconds to render. It will be a little ugly in the beginning, but then it should all be nice and beautiful. There's a lot of text, and that is mostly so once you go home and you want to like reiterate or like go back to what we've done, so you can read all the things that basically I'll tell you now. So there's no need for you to read. It will be easy to follow, and I'll guide you to like which particular figure or line of code you should be scrolling to. Okay, so let's get started. Oops. It's not my laptop, it's not my desktop. Okay, part 1. Function representation are dissociable in linear neural networks, and most of what I'm telling you is like a very simplified version of results that are part of this paper. Not all solutions are created equal in an analytical dissociation of functional representational similarity in deep linear neural networks. So if you feel like after the session you didn't get enough math or you want to know all the details, that's the place to go. Okay, so first, very broadly, I want to introduce 2 concepts that will be like very important throughout the tutorials. Is the one of a function, and a function is just describing how some inputs are mapped to some outputs. Like we can think of it in a very general sense that literally is like a black box. You put something in, it does something, it puts something out. But we here, I guess, are most interested in the brain. Or artificial neural networks. And so we can think of this function as, for example, an animal that's like trying to learn a decision task. You like cue it with some image or some sound, and then the animal, for example, has to give a go and no-go response by like licking or withhold licking. Or if you're more like in the behavioral sciences, for example, a human in like a reaction time task, we can show them a certain image and they have to click a left or right button. Or like also like an artificial neural network. You show it an image, it does some processing, and then tells you, oh, there's a cat. So, and I think kind of the central goal that is shared between all of them when we kind of want to understand them, whatever that means, is that we want to figure out how are these functions implemented. Like we can very easily observe the surface, like the mouse does click or does not click. So we kind of can observe the input-output interactions, but we want to figure out what's going on inside, like how is it done. And so to study how specific functions are implemented, we usually record and analyze the activity of that the system is producing. For example, we can put a multi-electrode, a single electrode into the mouse's brain while it's performing a task. And then usually kind of what we're doing is kind of reverse engineering. We're kind of trying to infer from our recording something about the brain. So given a measurement of neural activity, the question is kind of, can we infer the underlying input-output function and what's going on? And then is the question we'll be asking using extremely simple neural networks. So we'll be using two-layer linear neural networks, and we use them as like a canonical model of this basic transformations from inputs to hidden representations to outputs, like in a very abstract way. Like your inputs could be some downstream neural activity, it could be some task labels, it could be an image, and then you have some processing in the brain. It's highly recurrent. There's millions or billions of neurons involved, and you generate a hidden neural activity, and from that then we generate some behavior or some downstream neural activity. And so kind of the simplest model of this process from inputs to hidden activity to outputs is such a linear neural network. So this is still kind of abstract. So let's make it even more simple. Let's go to a network where we have one input neuron, one hidden neuron, and one output neuron. And so what we'll do is like we have one input, it's just a number, it's just a scalar. We multiply it with a weight to generate a hidden representation, which is also just a scalar. And then we multiply it again with a second weight to generate the output. So from input, the output is just x times w1, gives the hidden representation. And then from hidden activity, the output is h times w2. So this is literally just multiplication. Super simple. So now that we have this model, let me give you an example to make it like really clear. So x could be 0.5, W1 could be 1, W2 could be 2. So what's happening in the first processing layer, we multiply 0.5 by 1, so the hidden representation is 0.5. And then in the second layer, we multiply the 0.5 by 2, and the output is a 1. Please don't fall asleep. So this is very easy, but like because this kind of mapping is very important, we now have our first little super simple exercise. So if you go to the home page, and scroll down just below this picture, can you actually see my mouse? I can see my mouse, perfect. And you see that we define there an input, target outputs, and the two weights, and then we have a function that is implementing the scalar network. So all you kind of have to do is like you have to multiply W1 by x, and then you have to generate the output by multiplying W2 by y hat. And then you can run the code, and we'll like verify if you're doing the right thing by playing this little play button. And if you feel uncomfortable with scalar multiplication, there's also a little unfolding hydraulic thing to show you the solution. So just take a few seconds and implement that function if you like. Do you need if someone needs the URL again, it's always at the bottom right. Sorry, here's the URL. Is anyone running into major issues? It's the first time that we're running this, obviously, with so many people. Okay, so you're all capable of opening the home page. Oh, okay. So the Wi-Fi seems to be too slow, or you don't know the key. Do you know the password? What's? Okay. Okay, I guess I can't fix that. I think for now I'll slowly carry on. As I said, all these things, sorry. Maybe someone wants to share data with 200 people?
Airdrop.
Can you maybe look up the password again? Yeah. Like if you're affiliated with a university, you should also be able to use eduroam. Okay, I'll slowly move forward. So let's assume we have implemented this. We can ask two questions. The first one is what function does this network implement? And the second one is like what pattern of null activity does this network use to implement the function? So we have once kind of the network function and once the hidden representation. And there, if we look a little bit, it becomes very obvious that neural networks are very degenerate. The function that we want to implement and the parameterization that we use are not one-to-one. Like we can implement exactly the same network that maps 0.5 to 1 by either setting W1 to 1 and W2 to 2, or W1 to 2 and W2 to 1, or W1 to square root of 2 and W2 to square root of 2. So this is kind of tedious to trying to elaborate all the possible solutions, but I'd like to ask you in slightly further down to implement two additional networks that solve the task of mapping from 0.5 to 1. So you just have to find like two weights that will implement the same network function. If I would know how to use a Mac, I could make the font bigger. Here we go. And right below you have the second cell, and it's basically asking you, okay, you can do this by, for example, multiplying by 4 and 0.5, implements exactly the same function. Can you do this with negative weights? So instead of using positive weights, can you use negative weights? Was not on that, but I think it was the NYU guest. Oh, there. So if you need the password for I'm just yelling out a password to like a lot of people. The password is 566 Gerbal for the Wi-Fi, if that was information you were missing. Okay, so as you can see, there's many different weight combinations that implement exactly the same function. And because this is a little tedious to like kind of just try to find them by hand, let's try to do this more systematically. So in order to do this more systematically, I would like to introduce like a mental concept that's really helpful for the rest of the tutorials, and that's the idea of a weight space. So let's assume you have a biological or artificial neural networks, and there's many neurons and many connections. And so these connections can change, but at every given time, there's one set of connections strength that the network is actually using. So we can think of the space of all possible functions that a network can implement, and that's the so-called weight space, where every axis is one weight value, and then one point in this high-dimensional space is one specific implementation. So it's, again, a little abstract, so let's go back to our beloved two-layer neural network. Here, we only have two weights, so it's two axes, so we can actually plot it. And so on the x-axis, we have W1, and on the y-axis, we have W2. and I have plotted in color the network output for all those possible combinations. Like we choose all possible W, or like at least within a certain range. We choose a W1 and a W2, and we do this for all the different combinations, and we each time calculate the network output. And so what we get is this weight space. And what you see here is that, and I've changed the color bar such that 2, that's our target network output, is white. And what you can see is that there is 2 like parabola-looking subspaces that are all white. So it seems like there's a lot of different combinations of weights here that all generate our target output. So let's think a little bit more about this weight space. And to this end, I would now like to invite you to use the first interactive figure. So if you scroll down a bit, you will have the weight space, and just below the weight space, now I have to get out a little bit, there's 2 sliders, and you can actually change the input and the network output. So as you move this around, for example, instead of having input 1 and target 2, we can go to input minus 1.75, and you can see our weight space changes. Now, because we've changed the inputs, we plot all possible outputs for different weight combinations. And you see now, like, we still have those 2 white hyperbolas, but they are now in 2 different quadrants. So if we want to think about how can we implement a function, we can start thinking about this weight space. Like, what are the different combinations of parameters that will implement exactly our target function or the same function? Can I have a hand? Who's with me? Does that make sense so far? Okay, I lost quite a few people, or people don't like raising their hands. That's all. Okay, so now that in this weight space, we can think about what I've just described with these wide curves as equivalence sets. So this is a collection of all possible parameter configurations, like square root of 2 and square root of 2, and 2 and 1, and 1 and 2, and minus 2 and 1, and we collect them all together. Then if we have them all collected, that's the equivalent set. So this is all possible parameter sets that implement exactly the same function. And now we come to the most important concept, kind of that is going through the whole of the tutorial, and that's the idea of a parameter symmetry. So instead of picking those weights by hand, we want to find a formula or some kind of description that is describing the whole equivalence set. So instead of enumerating them by hand, we get a formula that's telling us what parameters can we use to have a certain function to be implemented. And for our 2 neural network, what we can see is that if we make one of the weights, if you make W1 bigger, we have to make W2 smaller. That makes sense, right? You multiply 2 numbers, so if you want to preserve the input, the mapping from input to output, as you make the input weight bigger, if you want to preserve the output, you have to make the output weight smaller. Or down here, if you flip the sign, then if you make one of them negative, you also have to make the other one negative. So what we can do is we can pick any solution, for example, our square root 2 solution, and we can multiply that solution for W1 by any q to make it like bigger or smaller to flip the sign, and then simply also simultaneously transform W2, and by multiplying by 1 over q, so we're making it smaller when we make it bigger or the other way around, and this exactly preserves the function of the network, because W tilde times W1 tilde is equal to W2 1 over q times W1. 1 over q times q is simply canceling out, so it's disappearing. So the function we are computing is still exactly the same. And you can, again, in the notebook, go to the next interactive plot, where you can now choose a value of q. So what I've plotted here is still the weight space. I've now highlighted in yellow the equivalent set. So this is all possible weight combinations that preserve exactly our input-output map. And then to the right of it, I have plotted the weight values and the network output. And as you can see, as I'm changing q, we're changing our weight values, but the network output is not changing at all. And the green star is telling like one specific implementation. So that is that one point in parameter space or weight space that we're choosing specifically. Who is still with me? Please show me your hands. This is looking great. Thank you. Oh. OK, we introduced 4 concepts. The first one is the idea of a weight space. So each axis corresponds to a network parameter. We've talked about a specific implementation, so that's one point in weight space. We have talked about an equivalent set. That's a collection of all possible parameter configurations that implement exactly the same function. And lastly, we have introduced the idea of a parameters symmetry. That's a transformation in weight space that changes the network's parameters without changing the function that we actually implement. OK. So now we come to the thing that we kind of teased you with during our keynote, and that is that function representation are dissociable, and that kind of directly follows from this logic. So we have learned that we can transform the network with this 1 over q transformation without changing the function, but we're changing W1, and thus we're changing the hidden activity. Because instead of using W1x, we now use QW1x. So our hidden representation is changing. However, the network function stays exactly the same. So again, we visualize this in the notebook. So if you go down a little bit, it looks very similar. You can, again, choose a value of q. You will see how the weight values change. You'll see how the hidden activity is changing as a result, and how the network output is perfectly preserved. So you can, for example, make q very small. You see you get a specific implementation, gives us weight values, gives us a hidden activity, and we still have exactly the same network output, or we could produce a large one, and the hidden activity is changing while we preserve the network output. So do you agree with me that in this super simple example, function and representation are somewhat dissociated? They're like not the same. If you agree with me, please raise your hands. OK, thank you. Oh, I might keep doing that. OK, so transformations with Q leave the input-output function unchanged. However, they transform the hidden activity. And what also additionally follows from this is that we can actually use almost any hidden activity. Because if you make Q bigger, we make 1 over Q smaller, and the other way around. That means there's really only one value for Q that we can't really use, and that is 0, because you're not allowed to divide by 0. But in theory, and obviously this works not for the brain because we can't make activity infinitely large, but in theory we can have we could observe any hidden activity value in this mini network and still implement exactly the same function. Interestingly, the reverse is also true. We can keep the hidden representation exactly fixed, but we're changing the function, because we can do most of the work in our readout weights. That means that if you scroll further down, now we have a setting where we can, again, change the input and network output. And yes, you will see the hidden activity will stay exactly the same, but we're changing the function. So you see, like, the weight space changes, but your hidden activity stays exactly fixed. And so if you want to start comparing networks using the hidden representations, we're running into big problems here, at least in theory. Who's still with me? Great, thank you. That was a little boring. I know, just scalar multiplication. Let's make it a little bit more exciting. It will still only do linear regression, but it's a little bit more exciting. So let's say that our inputs, instead of like just one input, we have now vectors that are multiplied by a whole matrix that maps to like a hidden representation, which again is a whole vector. So we have like multiple hidden neurons, and then we have another matrix that's mapping the hidden representation to outputs. So what's happening if we go into this regime? It turns out that we can do exactly the same thing, and instead of using a scale of 1 over q, we can use a matrix, a random matrix transformation, and its inverse. So as long as q can be inverted, we have exactly the same principle. So we can again project our W1 matrix, this time by matrix q and not by a scalar q, and W2 by the inverse of q. And then we see that the new network function, because q minus 1 in q, if you don't know linear algebra, that basically just means exactly the same thing, like multiplying q with 1 over q. They cancel out. And so we preserve exactly the same function. But again, we transfer the hidden representation. Q can like scoop around, stretch, rotate your hidden representation very wildly. So again, I have a little interactive notebook for this, or like one figure for this, where now we have this plot here, and so we have 2 input neurons, 2 hidden neurons, and 2 output neurons. So it's still, each thing is 2D, so we can plot it. However, we can't plot weight space anymore because there is now 8 weights, because we have 4 weights in the first layer, 4 weights in the second layer. Now, our input is just this little x down here, and our network output is here. And now we can change our Q, and that will move around our hidden activity. It will change W1, and it will change W2. However, the input-output map stays exactly the same. And now we can do one more step. That was only one input. Obviously, our brain is processing many, many inputs. We have like a lot of different experiences. So instead of like having just one input, we can have many of them. And then we now introduce the concept of a representational geometry. The representational geometry is the idea if you have you experience multiple things, it generates different activation patterns, one after another. You first see a cat, you walk down the street, you see a dog, and those will generate activity patterns. The question we can ask is then, how similar are they, or how dissimilar are they? And the most easy measure of the similarity is the dot product. So we simply multiply those 2 activity patterns, and we calculate the inner product, and then this is equivalent to the length of how big the activity is in activity space. So you can think like how far this is the point away from the origin and their angle. So again, if I find it, we have a small visualization for this, where you can now have 2 representations, one for object I, one for object j, and you can change how long they are, and you can change how they relate to each other rotational-wise in the 2-dimensional hidden space. And as you can see, if they are correlated, meaning if they are pointing into the same direction, the dot product is positive. And if they are exactly orthogonal, then it's 0, and then if it's kind of swinging to the other direction and point in different direction, it's becoming negative. So we can, there's now for 2 objects, but we know there's many different experiences, many different neural activation patterns. We want to compare the similarity across all of them. So what we can calculate is the so-called gram matrix. So the gram matrix is a matrix that has size items by items, so think like dog, cat, car, whatever. And then you calculate the dot products between all possible combinations. So for example, this entry here is telling you the similarity between item 2 and item 1. Who's with me? Perfect. Maybe this is all way too easy. I'm sorry. And again, but it's very obvious from the math that we've done, because age is depending on our choice of Q, the gram matrix, meaning our representational geometry, also depends on our choice of Q. If we're changing Q, then our gram matrix is going to transform. And again, there is a part in the notebook where you can investigate this. So now we have 5 different inputs. We have an input space, an output space. Again, it's 2 input neurons, 2 hidden neurons, 2 output neurons. And now we can again play around with Q, and we can see that our hidden space is going to be transformed while the input and output space stays the same. And as you can see, as we're changing this, our gram matrix is going to transform as well, because we're changing how the different points in the space relate to each other. That means we can exactly preserve our function, but we can change the representational geometry. And also, just a little bit below, again, we can do the same thing where we keep the hidden representation fixed, but we change our inputs and our outputs. So we can resample what we want our network's output mapping to be. And we can do this while keeping the gram matrix perfectly fit, but now we obviously compute a different function. We can also change what our inputs are. We exactly preserve the hidden representation of the geometry, but the network does a completely different thing. So we now kind of went to higher dimensions to show that function representation and the corresponding representation geometry are doubly dissociable. The same function can be implemented using different representations, and the same representation can support different functions. And that maybe, I don't know with what intuitions you walked into this tutorial, but for me, that kind of was very counterintuitive at first, even though the math is not very complicated, but for me, it always helps using these teeny, tiny little models, and then to just figure out what's actually going on and which degrees of freedom do we actually have. Okay, so next I want to talk about two of the assumptions that we often underlie to some degree when we do representational comparisons. And so one of them is that each task has a privileged representation or representational geometry, and the second one is functional equivalence implies representational alignment. That means if two networks start to do more and more of the same thing, what should happen automatically is that the representation should become more similar as well. And we're now going to use the semantic hierarchy that I already introduced during the keynote. And so in this case, inputs are objects, and network outputs are are concepts that are organized in multiple levels of abstraction. So the cat is a mammal and animal and alive, the owl is a bird and animal and alive, and the oak tree is a tree, a plant, and alive. And so we can now build a network that is solving this. So our inputs are just one-hot inputs. They're very often we really like to use those in the more cognitive sciences or psychology. We say oh, the brain sees a cat, but instead of showing the image, we just tell it yeah, this entry in this vector represents a cat, because that's way more easy than using actual image. And then the network output is again the categories, so the associations between items and where they are in the semantic hierarchy. So the cat is alive, it's an animal, it's a mammal, and it is a cat, but it's not a vegetable and it's not a tree. And we don't need to train a network, but we can just build a network magically by hand that is solving this. And then it turns out from our Q algebra that we did that there's generally no privileged representation, because we can just change our Q, do exactly the same input-output function, but change the gram matrix in our weights. So if you go down a little bit in the notebook, what you see here is the following plot. So we have our inputs and we have our network outputs. We have our input weights, we have the hidden activity and the output weights, and we have our gram matrix. And what we can do, we can just resample a new solution. So you'll see W1H and W2 changes, the gram matrix changes, but our network output is exactly the same. We keep doing the same thing, but everything else changes. Who's still with me? Perfect. Also, then the second point, as two networks become more similar, we've just seen that they can basically, in theory, use any kind of representation. Then the function that they implement, their representation need not to become increasingly more similar. There's, in theory, no need for this to happen. And again, we have this little interactive thing here. Now we have two networks. In this case, they solve exactly the same task, and they have exactly the same gram matrix. But we can sample a new network that uses a different representational geometry. So now we have two networks that solve exactly the same task. And if we would now start comparing those two, depending on how extreme the case is, we maybe think that they're implementing very different functions, even though they implement exactly the same function. The reverse is also true. We can let the network implement a completely different function. So network 2 now has a different function to implement. However, they can still rely on exactly the same geometry. Okay, so that poses two questions. Like, kind of all what I presented so far is a little bit pessimistic. But actually, I don't think the situation is so bleak, because what we often see is that when we do representational comparisons, so if we look at our FMA data, there often is structure. It's not arbitrary. So even though it can, in theory, be arbitrary, in practice, it often looks similar to the task structure. So, and secondly, that also poses the question, like, why do biological and artificial systems often develop non-arbitrary representations that reflect the structure of the task? And this is where things get a little more mathematical, and if you want to, the proofs for this are in the paper. But I'll give you, again, an intuition with some visualizations. So you remember this white line in weight space, right? So there's many different configurations. There is a way to not allow a network to just go to any of those points in those two curves, but say you can only go to specific points. And maybe even we can pick those specific points such that we do have a meaningful geometry. And it turns out that those regions do exist. So for example, we can restore representational identifiability by imposing additional constraints beyond requiring the networks to implement a particular function. So we don't only say, like, you have to solve the semantic hierarchy task, but also you have to do it in a specific way. And one of those specific ways is a so-called minimum representation norm parametrization. And so these do minimize the joint norm of the hidden representation and the readout weights among all possible parametrizations. So we now say you're only allowed to pick parametrizations for which this quantity is minimized. So you have to make your representations activity as small as possible and simultaneously make your readout weights as small as possible. I mean, obviously they can't go to 0 because then you don't implement the function anymore. So you have to find like some kind of middle ground. So let's go back to our very simple scalar network where we visualize the equivalent set and the weight space. And if we do this analytically and we try to find these solutions, we see that there's exactly 2 points that are solutions and that minimize this quantity. And one of them is here and the other one is here. And it turns out that one of them is 2 and 1 and the other one is -2 and 1. And what is nice is that they have the same representational geometry because they share W2. That is, do I have another slide for this? No, I do not. So if you remember, we calculate the dot product to get the activity in a single neural network. It's basically the square. We just multiply the two values. So 2 square and -2 square are the same numbers. So the hidden geometry has to be exactly the same. And it further turns out that this generalizes to higher dimensions. So in this case, and again, we have a little thing in our notebook, we now go to the network with 2 input, 2 hidden, 2 output neurons. It turns out there's many different minimum representational parametrizations that all have exactly the same gram matrix, but they have different weights and different hidden representations. So we preserve the gram matrix so they come comparable. So a small interim summary, functional equivalence alone does not justify representational comparisons. In theory, they could be arbitrary. And comparisons are only supported when both systems are known to operate in exactly the same interferable solution class. So if I compare 2 brains, or if I compare a brain to a network, I need to know that they are both picking, for example, minimum representation non-parametrizations. If they do, then my comparison becomes meaningful again, but only then. Okay, and there's 2 further tweaks. Those parameterizations also turn out to be like most robust to parameter noise, and they're guaranteed to be have task-specific representations. So in the case of our semantic hierarchy task, we get this beautiful block structure that obeys the structure, or that is determined by the structure of the task instead of arbitrary choice of parameterizations. Okay, with this I would like to summarize. network functional representation are doubly dissociable in two-layer linear networks. This distribution can be understood through parameter symmetries. And functional equivalence alone does not justify representational comparisons, but we have to add additional constraints that restrict the representational flexibility to guarantee that our representational geometry is actually identifiable. With this, I would like to hand over to the second tutorial. And while we're setting up, maybe we have some time if you have a specific question that you'd like to ask. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah. Hi. You sit up. Yeah.
C'est bon. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting tutorial. So I was wondering, when you have multiple tasks, to what extent would a constraint like that, so let's say it's the one network, but we want to train it from multiple tasks, or like some kind of continual learning or something like that?
Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so, yeah.
I think the weight space is a very nice way to think about things like continual learning, because you can think of like as you add more data, different parameters will actually solve your task. But I think, and maybe I should have highlighted this more, importantly, these Q transformations, first of all, are not the only parameter symmetry that is available. Like there is way more things we can do in our network that still preserve the input output. Like there was one example. If you want to have more details, please refer to the paper. And the second one is, these Q transformations, they're independent of the task. It could be literally any task, like it does not depend on X, it does not depend on Y, because it's a property of the network. It's a property of the neural network.
So then if you minimize, for instance, the norm, so I add the additional constraint that you were adding, if we have multiple tasks, then it wouldn't lead to task-specific representational geometry, would it?
Yeah, like even with one task, if you put in the additional constraint, you know that in the linear network you can show that you will get a specific representational geometry that is unique for that task.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe also a question directly to that topic. Sorry if somebody else wants to say something. Okay. Yeah, did you also check if you added that constraint to your optimization function, the representations that evoked out of it, were they more biologically plausible?
I mean, it really depends on how you define biologically plausible. I think we know that usually or often we made this observation, and this is like where a lot of like representational comparison analysis stems from, is like we see that there is structure. They're not arbitrary in general. At least like if you let people learn something for long enough, yeah.
Okay.
So like you saw this block structure, that is something that someone would expect doing an fMRI experiment on the semantic hierarchy task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I made the experience that, for example, if I, in a very applied project, for example, where I train in a multitask regime behavioral data to RNNs, constrain them and their network size, and then have a regularization regime of high L1 and low L2 regularization, for example, I see more biologically plausible internal representations that are very robust and have highest test performance. And I thought maybe that also goes
exactly, like in theory we could have arbitrary representations. Once we add additional constraints, like L2, you restrict it and you have less flexibility.
Exactly.
But that is, you know, like, why do brains go there? Do they go there? Do our artificial neural networks go there? When we compare them, when do they go there? Like, there's this whole box of questions that I think we should be focusing on to, like, dissociate and differentiate them. But I now would like to hand on to the second part time-wise. But thank you for your questions.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so for the second tutorial, I'd ask you to go back to the website, and then for tutorial 2, do not click on hands-on tutorial, but click on slides. So even if that's counterintuitive, you click on slides, and then this again take a few seconds to load. And then you should see something like this, and then you either press F on your keyboard or you go to this little icon in the top right corner, and then you should have this full screen on your laptop, because I won't have you code in this tutorial, but I'll just have you fiddle around with these interactive elements the same way that Lukas did it. Yeah, and then to navigate through here, so you can follow me along, you just use the arrow key, so you press forward and you'll go forward, and if you want to go back, you just go back. All right, so I'll have to do the same thing that Erin already did in the keynote, and that's sort of calling out the elephant in the room, which is that the tutorial led by Lukas focuses on linear networks, and while, well, I guess we hope that you think that this was really, really cool stuff, at the same time you might be thinking that this is a very restricted model class, and the networks we're typically interested in are highly nonlinear, right? So there's 3 questions that naturally arise from this, and I've written them down here, and the first one is, well, which of the degeneracies that Lukas showed you, for example, the rescaling or the multiplication with this matrix Q and its inverse, which of these actually carry over from the linear setting to the nonlinear setting? And perhaps once we're in the nonlinear setting, are there new degeneracies that weren't even there in the linear case? The second is, does this dissociation between function and representation that Lukas showed you, does this still hold in the nonlinear setting? Or are we perhaps magically getting rid of this by just throwing the nonlinearity in there? And then finally, and that is also sort of giving away the answer to the second question already, is the question of, does the identifiability result you saw in the linear setting at the very end of Lukas' tutorial, does that also carry over to the nonlinear setting? And so in this tutorial, we'll go through these 3 questions one by one, and you'll see at the very end that the answers in the nonlinear setting are actually surprisingly similar to the linear setting. And so we're going to start by looking at which degeneracies we actually have when we look at nonlinear networks. So just to recap, basically, what Lukas showed you already, and unfortunately, I'll say this once, the subscripts on all of the slides are a bit tiny, but I guess they're still, at least on your laptop, you should be able to read them. And unfortunately, that's a bug that we can't do anything about as of now, but we'll get this fixed soon, hopefully. But back to the linear network. So a linear network, the way Lukas showed you, is just effectively, you can think of it as a multiplication of matrices, right? So the 2-layer network that Lukas showed you, you'd have 2 matrices, W2, W1, and then your output is simply W2, W1 multiplied by X, and then in this case that I'm presenting here, I'm adding a bias as well. And what's important is this subsequent multiplication of multiple matrices always collapses into just a single multiplication with a single matrix. Right? So a linear network will always look something like this, no matter how many hidden layers you throw in there. So that's the second point that's on here. Increasing depth doesn't give you anything more for linear networks. Right? So if I were to throw in like a 3rd and a 4th and a 5th layer, it will always still reduce to something like this. Right? It's a single matrix multiplication and then a potential bias if we want to allow for biases. So now, if we go to a similarly simple setting as Lukas looked at, which is now we look at inputs that have 2 dimensions, and we want to map this to a 1-dimensional output, what this looks like is just a simple linear combination of the 2 input dimensions. So we have W1, X1 plus W2, X2 plus the bias tagged on, right? So in particular, if you then look at the places where this simple network constantly outputs 0, you just take this equation, you set it to 0, and you solve it, and then what you get is something like this, right? Where X2 is this factor times X1 minus this constant, and this should look awfully familiar to everybody in here, because that's just the parameterization of a line, right? So you have your slope here, and then you have your y-intercept here. And this line is typically called the decision boundary, and the output of this linear network varies perpendicular to it. And you'll see all of this in a second in the animation, so if this is a bit fuzzy right now, I think it'll become clear in a second. So importantly, the weights you choose, they decide basically how this decision boundary is placed in the 2-dimensional plane. And so we'll see this in a second, but the first thing that we now need to leave the linear regime is we need a nonlinear task, right? And we're going to use the same task that you've already seen in the keynote, which is the XOR task. So just let me briefly recap what the task here is. You have these 4 data points in the simplest setting, and you want to distinguish them into 2 classes. So you want to classify the bottom left and the upper right data point into 1 class, and you want to classify the bottom right and the top left data points into a separate class. Right? And what we know is that this task, you cannot solve it with the linear network that I've showed you on the previous slide. And I don't want to just tell you this, but I want you to see this for yourself. So what we have is now the first interactive element. And throughout this tutorial, I'll skip these instructions and instead just go to the interactive element and then show you what you can do. But if you want to take a look at this at home, then we have the instructions there for you. So now, on the left, you see again the XOR task with these 4 data points. And you see the output heat map in the background of it in a similar way that Lukas visualized it before. And so this white line is exactly this decision boundary I talked about a second ago. And then this arrow is the direction it is facing. And so the output is increasing into this direction. So red means higher output and blue means lower output. And now what I would like you to do is you have these 2 sliders again where you can play around a bit with the orientation. So if you play around with this slider, you'll see that the decision boundary will start tilting. And then with this second slider, you can move it around. You can move around the offset from the center. And I just want you to play around with this for like 30 seconds and see how many so maybe let me say a few words on this here. So on the right, you now see again the 4 data points. And then you see whether when the color matches, you see that you're classifying correctly. And when it doesn't match, then it tells you that you're not classifying correctly. And now you can wiggle around with this for like 30 seconds and see how many out of the 4 data points you can get correct. And so ideally, you shouldn't get all 4 of them correct, because otherwise we'd have a problem, because then we would need nonlinear networks for this setting. But I'll let you play around with this for a second. So maybe for those, if you're still having Wi-Fi issues, I'll also demonstrate this here live for you. So what you should notice is that you simply cannot get all 4 correct, right? So the best you can do is that you classify all 3 correct, right? So if you rotate around, now I'm getting 3 incorrect, and if I rotate some more, now I'm getting 2 correct again. And then if I'm in this position, all of a sudden I'm getting these 3 correct, but I'm misclassifying this one in the bottom left corner, right? So that's the typical thing that we know, is that XOR is not linearly separable, which just means you cannot put a single line in this plane that properly separates the 4 points in the way that we want them to be separated. So the best you can do is you get 3 out of 4 correct, but no more than that, right? And as I said, the last point, depth doesn't help you with this. So if this was just a 1 hidden layer neural network, and if you now add multiple hidden layers to this, that doesn't change anything, right? What you saw still holds. You cannot solve this with linear networks. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to throw in a nonlinearity to see if a nonlinear network can fix this. And I just briefly want to show you the 2 nonlinear activation functions that we look at in this tutorial here, which is the relu activation function you see on the left. So that's just flat 0 or negative inputs. So it doesn't respond to negative inputs at all. And on the positive half line, it's just the identity, right? So it's basically just gating negative inputs. It's not responding to negative inputs at all. And to positive inputs, it's responding basically like a linear function, like the identity. And then on the right, you have the hyperbolic tangent, which looks a bit different. And perhaps you would say that looks a bit more nonlinear because it's more curved. And it's just a second nonlinearity that we'll use throughout this tutorial. So now that we have nonlinearities, we can actually find nonlinear neural networks that solve this XOR task. And that's what I'm visualizing here for you. So it's the same concept. The lines are these decision boundaries, but now that there's decision boundaries of nonlinear neurons, and the heat map and the data markers are all the same. And so what you should see here is that we have 6 qualitatively different solutions. So if you look at the decision boundaries of the individual neurons, you'll see they're all different between the solutions. And they separate nicely into 2 families. So the top row sort of looks like what I call the diagonal family, because it's solving it basically using this diagonal structure, and the bottom row is solving the task using this anti-diagonal structure, right? So these are the solutions you'll see repeatedly throughout this tutorial. And then while we're at the figures that I'll be using throughout this tutorial, there's two more, and you've seen both of them already in Lukas's tutorial. The first one is just the hidden activation matrix, and I'm plotting this the same way that Lukas was plotting it, where columns correspond to the 4 stimuli that we're using in this task, and the rows correspond to the hidden neurons of our network. So if I go back, you always saw 2 decision boundaries here, so these networks all just use 2 neurons, so therefore our hidden activation matrix has 2 rows. And then the RSM is just a gram matrix that Lukas introduced, so that's just the H transpose H, and I'm only showing you the bottom triangular part of this matrix because this matrix is by definition symmetric, so the upper right would look basically exactly the same as the lower left. So that's basically all of the visual elements that you need to understand to follow along. And now this brings me to the first question that I posed at the very beginning, and that's which of the degeneracies that Lukas showed you actually carry over from the linear setting to the nonlinear setting? Right, so at the very beginning of Lukas's tutorial, you saw that you could inversely scale the incoming weight W1 and the outgoing weight W2 with this parameter Q, I believe, in Lukas's tutorial. We're now just calling this gamma, but it's exactly the same thing. And now you might think, well, if I now throw a nonlinearity at the hidden layer, that'll get rid of all of this altogether, so I can't do any of this rescaling. And basically, this is all fixed, and this is all taken care of. So this is the next interactive. So as I said, I'll skip the instructions and instead show you what you can do. So now on the very left here, you can switch between the 2 activation functions I showed you. So you have the ReLU activation function and the hyperbolic tangent, and you can switch between those by just toggling them. And then here you again see a network very similar to what Lukas showed you, 1 input, 1 hidden neuron, 1 output, and we start with both weights just equal to 0. And then you can play around with this slider, with this scaling parameter, and this will change the parameterization of this second network. So it'll just simply apply this rescaling. And then you can watch what happens to the hidden activation, whether that changes, and what happens to the output. And so what you ideally would want is, for the degeneracy from Lukas to survive, is that the output stays fixed, but the hidden activation changes. So I'll again let you play around with this, and then ideally, try this for both ReLU and the hyperbolic tangent, and then see where you can keep the output fixed and where you cannot, and where the difference is between the 2 activation functions. So I'll again do this live on screen as well. So we'll start with the ReLU activation function, and then if I move this slider to the more positive, you'll see that the hidden activation gets scaled up, but the output stays exactly fixed. And so this is exactly the same behavior you saw in the previous tutorial. And I can also scale it down a bit, right? So the hidden activation again changes and output stays fixed. But once I go to negative values that you also were able to use in a linear setting, then of course the output all of a sudden looks very different, right? So then stuff starts to break. Right? So I cannot rescale with negative values if I use the ReLU activation function, but I can still rescale with arbitrary positive values. And now if I go to the hyperbolic tangent, so maybe let's go back to 1.0. So this is where we started, right? When gamma is at 1, it looks, this is just the hyperbolic tangent. And then if I increase this, it immediately starts breaking. And so for the hyperbolic tangent, I cannot rescale with arbitrary positive values. And I also can't rescale with arbitrary negative values. But what I can do is I can rescale exactly with -1. So I can flip the sign of the incoming weights and the sign of the outgoing weights, and that'll keep the output the same, but it basically flips the hidden activation, right? And both of these observations are simply due to the properties of these 2 activation functions. So the ReLU activation function is what's called positively homogeneous of degree 1, which is just a fancy name for saying exactly this, that you can transfer this positive scalar between the input and the output of the function. And the hyperbolic tangent is an odd function, so you can just transfer a negative sign from input to output. So that's the sign flip symmetry for the hyperbolic tangent. Right? So the answer to the question of which of the degeneracies carry over, it's the rescaling does carry over, but only in a very sort of restricted manner. And then the second sub-question of that first question I posed at the very beginning is, well, are there perhaps degeneracies in the nonlinear regime that we didn't observe in the linear regime, right? And we'll see that this is indeed the case. And what we'll start with is a simple setting where we now have 2 neurons instead of 1. They both have the same incoming weight W, but one of them has a flipped sign, right? So one of them has an incoming weight minus W, and then they have arbitrary outgoing weights A1 and A2. And now what we want to see is, given this structure where we have incoming weights that are effectively the same except for this sign flip, can we find some additional degeneracies that arise due to the nonlinearity? So that's the next interactive. So very similar to, it looks very similar as before. You again can flip around between the ReLU activation function and the hyperbolic tangent. The difference being you now have two hidden neurons. The incoming weights are what I said. We'll now set them to 1 and minus 1 to make it super simple. And we also set the readout weight of the first neuron to 1. And what you get to do now is you get to play around with the readout weight of the second neuron. And then you see basically the hidden activations of the 2 hidden neurons. And you see their combined output. And what I want you to do now is play around with this readout weight and see if you can find some degeneracy. So a point, a specification of this parameter where you don't have a nonlinear output, but something that looks more similar. So I'll again give you some time to do this yourself before I do this live here. All right, so I'll demo this again. We start with the ReLU activation function, and then if I increase this, I see this left arm of the output moving further up. So this doesn't seem to be leading anywhere. But if I decrease this weight, you'll see this left arm of the activation function coming down slowly. And if I set it exactly right, then you see that the output is actually a linear function. So what this means is I can have two units in my network that both are computing nonlinear functions, but together they basically degenerate to just a simple linear function, right? And if we look at what happens for the hyperbolic tangent, something similar happens. As I move this now up further, you'll see that this starts to look more and more like a flat line, and eventually it's just dead zero. So I can have 2 hidden units that use the hyperbolic tangent as an activation function. They'll compute nonlinear hidden activations, but their output, so the function they're computing, is just constantly 0. So they effectively cancel each other out. So the takeaway here is that there is additional degeneracies in nonlinear networks, and they depend, or they can depend, on the symmetry properties of the activation function that you happen to choose for your nonlinear network. And importantly, neither of these 2 degeneracies has a direct linear counterpart, right? This just doesn't happen in linear networks because we don't have these symmetries present in the activation function. And so these are just the mathematical relationships that give rise to the behavior that you saw. So this is just restating the 2 ReLU neurons that compute just a linear function, so just the identity, and the hyperbolic tangent, because you can carry out this negative sign, it just cancels to 0. So now we've seen that, there is, once we apply the nonlinear activation function at the hidden layer, it cancels out some of the degeneracies that we saw in the linear regime, It also gives rise to additional degeneracies. But now we may ask, is there maybe another opportunity for degeneracies to arise in nonlinear networks except through the nonlinear activation? And the answer is yes. And it depends basically on your size of your network. And intuitively, what can happen is if you make your network bigger than it needs to be to compute a given function, you're essentially introducing degrees of freedom for this network to choose, again, among different implementations. So this is this last question here on the slide. Are there degeneracies arising from this wiggle room that you attach to networks when you make them bigger than they need to be? And for this, we have another little interactive element, which looks like this. So on the left, you have basically the implementation that we start with. So now we have 2D inputs, we have 2 hidden neurons, and we have a one-dimensional output. And then you see this is one of the XOR solutions you saw at the very beginning, together with its hidden activation. And now this I'll just walk you through because there's not too much interactivity going on here. What you could do now, the first thing you could do is you take one of the neurons and you just copy. So you take this first neuron with the slightly darker incoming weights, you copy it, and then you distribute the outgoing weights in such a way that they sum up to the outgoing weight of your original neuron. And so what this is saying is this readout and this readout here, they add up exactly to this readout here. And what you see is the function doesn't change. So if you look at the output heat map and I go back and I switch between these, the heat map stays fixed, right? But the hidden activations, if you look at the hidden activation matrix, that clearly changes, right? Because I'm now introducing a third neuron to my network, so therefore the hidden activation matrix will have another row. And importantly, what you observe, if I keep doing this, what happens is that this first row is simply being duplicated, right? I'm not introducing anything fancy here, but I'm just duplicating this row. And if I now change how I distribute the readout weights, so if I now change this slider and put lots of readout on one neuron and very little on the other, you see that nothing changes here. Right? And that makes sense because the readout only happens after the hidden activation, so the hidden activations aren't influenced. And again, the output is also not influenced because that stays exactly fixed. And then something else that I could do is I could go back to this network and simply add a pair of networks at the bottom here, so with these green incoming weights, in such a way that their readout weights just cancel each other out. Right? And what's interesting here now, again, so you see that this additional group is this little guy over here, highlighted in gray. Right? So that's the group I'm introducing. So if you look at this heat map here and I go back, take this back out, and then I add it back in, the output heat map doesn't change, right? Because in the output, these two cancel each other out. But in the hidden activation matrix, what you see is actually we've now appended 2 new rows, and they look completely different from the hidden activations that the rest of the network computed, right? So I go back, and then I add them again, and I just get these 2 additional rows. So that's now 2 degeneracies that arise in nonlinear networks simply because we allowed the network to have more neurons than it needed. So if I go back, we could implement this function with 2 neurons, and we can't do it with 1. But 2 is the minimum number that we need. But once we allow the network to have more than these 2 neurons, then we get this additional freedom, and this results in degeneracies and freedom in the hidden activation matrix. And importantly, neither of these relied on the properties of the activation function, right? So that's why you didn't see any ReLU or any hyperbolic tangent in there. It's completely independent of this. And also, what you saw is that both of these degeneracies change the hidden activations that are being computed by this network. So that closes the first section, and that's the longest one of this tutorial, so don't worry. But it's that nonlinear networks have degeneracies, so the nonlinearity doesn't kill it, and nonlinear networks actually have 2 independent sources of degeneracies. One is the symmetries present in your activation function, so in the nonlinearity you add to the network, and the other just arises from networks being potentially bigger than they need to be to compute any given function. So now on to the second question that I posed at the beginning, which was, do we also see the dissociation of function and representation in nonlinear networks? And you can basically tell from this title, same task, different geometry, that this seems to be happening in nonlinear networks. So one question that was also posed already in the keynote and then repeated again by Lukas in his tutorial is, does the task that we use pin down a unique geometry? right? So the 6 XOR solutions I showed you at the very beginning, they were all trained on the same 4 data points that I showed you, and they all solved the task exactly. Nevertheless, and I haven't shown you this, but you'll see this in a second, the representational geometries all differ. Right? So clearly, solving the same task doesn't mean you have to employ the same representational geometry. So then, well, if the task does not fix the geometry, what does this difference in representational geometries that we observe correspond to? Or is there anything this difference corresponds to? So this is this next interactive element that I want you to play with for a little bit, and I'll give you a bit more time for this one, because this is basically one of the 2 most important ones in this tutorial. So let me briefly walk you through this. What you see here, so these gray squares are again 2 of the XOR solutions you saw at the beginning, but now I'm not showing you the entire output heat map, but all you get is like this little lens into the output heat map, right? And then to the left and to the right, you see the RSMs, so the different representational geometries. And what you can do is you can move the sliders around a bit to move across this output space, right? And what you can do is you can try to find another input stimulus where the 2 networks actually differ. And since I'm already running out of time, I'll just show you this instead of giving you more time for this interactive element. But what you see is if I move across now, the network is outputting the same, and then if I go up a bit or go down a bit, I see that eventually the network is giving different answers, right? So the right and the left network are giving different answers. And then if I look at another pair of networks and I do the same, then what you realize is for this one, it's a bit more difficult to find a stimulus where the 2 actually differ. But you can still find input stimuli where you would be able to tell the 2 networks apart. And so the takeaway here is, in this case, you have actually networks that, while they agree on the 4 input stimuli that you use to evaluate them, you could find stimuli that would still tell these apart. So the takeaway here is that solving the same task does not constrain representational geometry, but here you could at least find stimuli that would still tell the function apart. And so then I'll briefly go over this last bit and then finish up after this. The final question you can ask is, well, what happens now if the functions agree everywhere? So not just on a finite set of inputs, but for every possible input I throw at it, the 2 functions agree. And that's this last element, and that's the most important one perhaps to take away from here is, these 2 networks are exactly the same, except that I've added a group of these canceling neurons that you saw a while ago. And now what I can do is, and you see the representational geometries of these 2 networks underneath, and on the right you see a network from the opposite family that's computing something very differently. And now if I move this pair of 0 neurons or canceling neurons around, you can watch what the similarity score does that's computed to both of these networks. So the first bar is the similarity between the 2 networks on the left, and the lower bar is the similarity score between the 2 networks on the right. And you see that as I move this thing around here, representational geometry changes drastically, and these scores basically do whatever. Right? So I can completely dissociate function representation again in nonlinear networks. So that's the takeaway here. Identical functions can have completely different geometries, and the 2 representation and function dissociate. And because of time, I'll skip the identifiability parts, but I'll say if you want to find out how we can now restore the identifiability result that you saw in the linear setting, then just come to our poster tomorrow in the afternoon session, and I'll walk you through all of these bits. But, well, it's a bit buggy. It's not showing. But the giveaway is basically when we impose the same minimum norm implementation rules that Lukas showed you, we can again restore identifiability of representational geometries in basically a very similar manner that Lukas already showed you. So the takeaway without all of the theory being here is that these minimum norm implementation rules do recover identifiability in nonlinear networks. So just to summarize these 3 findings, the first one is some of the degeneracies from the linear setting carry over in a more restrained way, but then new ones appear that are, 1, due to the size of the network, and due to the symmetries in the activation function. And we can have function representation dissociate twice over, so you can have the same task being solved by different functions with different geometries, but you can also have the same task being solved by the same function and still have different geometries. And the identifiability result from the linear setting also extends to the nonlinear setting. And then we'll again have Ellie set up, and then I can take maybe 1 or 2 questions really quickly. So both of the effectively, what Lukas showed you was this minimum representation norm constraint, which is minimizing the hidden activation, as you said, and then the readout weights. What Lukas didn't show you is that you also have this minimum weight norm parameterization, and both of those from the linear setting carry over to the nonlinear setting. So I'm guessing your question is also whether one of the two is more plausible, I guess. Yeah, exactly. So I guess we're not arguing that either of these are particularly biologically plausible, but the normative constraints that you could reasonably place on your network's implementation that give rise to unique geometries.
Hi, can I? Thank you. So Lukas mentioned 2 consequences of the minimum norm that you implement as a constraint. One is that it's more robust to noise, and the other one is that it preserves some representational categories or correlations. And I wonder if that transforms also to nonlinear.
So this we actually haven't looked at in the nonlinear setting, the robustness to noise, but that would be interesting to look at. So that's not a satisfying answer, but that's the honest answer. We haven't looked at this yet.
And the representational, the correlational structure, that the results are kind of like make sense, they keep some of the correlation of the input.
Yeah, so what you can also see in the nonlinear setting is that when you impose these constraints, what happens is that the representational geometries get tied back to the function that's being computed, in the sense that if you have in your hidden representation a feature that's more relevant for the computation, in the sense that it's more strongly read out, then you also have to represent that feature more strongly or more prominently in your hidden activation. So you do have a similar mechanism going on in the nonlinear regime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for still being here. If you want to stand up and have a stretch for a second or two, because I know this has been quite a long session, please feel free. I'm just going to show you at the same time if I can... How do I get this back on? Oh, great, okay. So this is going to be in tutorial 3, and so you can see if you just go back to the main page, there's a tutorial 3 representational pluralism, and there's a notebook that's here that you can follow on with. And before the notebook, once you get it up, you might have to press play in the bottom right here, just to make sure it all renders before it can run. And we'll start. Great, so the aim of this tutorial is to take some of the insights we've seen about representational pluralism and think about how we might use these to guide empirical work. So in particular, I work on cognitive science, so experiments in humans, and this is going to be looking at, in particular, about a study where we're trying to look at individual differences and how they might pick out different representational solutions. But first of all, I just want to talk about some overarching principles. So first of all, we've already discussed this idea that there's no single privileged representation for a task. But it's also true that different families of representations can bring complementary benefits when we start looking at downstream affordances. So I think someone in the audience mentioned earlier continual learning settings, but this kind of environment where we're looking at whether a representation can generalize to new data, or whether a representation might have interference, for example, catastrophic forgetting, these are things that might differ between different families of representations. But importantly, there might still not be one privileged representation because there are trade-offs between these. So different representations will have different downstream benefits, and unless we know what we're going to be asked to do, there won't be a single best one. And finally, individual differences in cognition can be linked to these different families of representations via patterns of affordances. And what this means is that rather than thinking of this as a bug, that there are many different representations, we can think of this as a feature whereby people might be showing identical performance on particular tasks, but if we dive deeper and start to measure downstream behaviors, we might see that they might be underpinned by different representations. So again, this idea of representational pluralism can be a really useful tool for thinking about how to measure individual differences in a more nuanced way. So talking about individual differences, I want to go back to a quotation from over 100 years ago by Charles Darwin, where he said, "It is good to have hair splitters and lumpers." And what he was fundamentally talking about was these different forms of representations that bring complementary benefits. So on the one hand, there were the splitters, who, when they were learning about the taxonomy of different plants, were trying to emphasize and represent every distinction between the different plants. So we can think of this as trying to form as many different categories as possible to be able to have this very high-dimensional taxonomy. And on the other hand, there were people that he observed who were the lumpers, who were those that tended to lump by relevant features, so features like having particular kinds of leaves or having particular properties. And this idea that it's good to have both really brings about this notion of trade-offs, the idea that there are affordances that lumpers and splitters might bring downstream that tell them apart. So on one hand, lumpers might be better at generalizing based on the shared features of particular items. But on the other hand, splitters might be better at discriminating based on what may earlier have been thought of as irrelevant for a task, and also at avoiding interference between stimuli once they've learned. So what might this kind of representation look like in neural networks? Lukas, I think, has already talked about this idea of task-specific and task-agnostic representations, but just to spell this out in a kind of taxonomy-style setting, you can imagine we can take a simple, again, linear two-layer network and show it in the input layer some different plants, and it's trained to perform a single simple output on something like whether or not these plants have leaves or not. Sorry, I said plants. 2 of those are mushrooms. That's the point. And again, this network can learn this task perfectly with very different representational solutions. So on the one hand, it can form these task-specific solutions, where by the time you get to the hidden layer, all of the irrelevant detail about these inputs have been compressed, and all we see is the task-specific information. So in this case, whether or not each input will be a 1 for yes has leaves or a 0 for no it doesn't. And so that RDM might look something like this, where the 2 plants are grouped together and look identical, and the 2 mushrooms are negatively grouped together and also look identical. But on the other hand, we can imagine there being more task-agnostic solutions, where each input will be identical to itself, but will be completely dissociable from all the other inputs that are seen. And as it turns out, you can get these different representations to form in 2-layer neural networks by changing just a single parameter. So that's the variance of the initial weights around 0 from the input layer to the hidden layer. So as you'll see in the tutorial, we're going to initialize a network all to have weights that are formed from a Gaussian distribution around 0, but you can change how big the magnitude of those weights will be based on this initialization. And it turns out that if you initialize a network in this setting with small weights, you get a rich network that forms this task-specific regime. And if you initialize with large weights, it forms these task-agnostic style representations, which have been called lazy networks in the literature. And there are lots of citations for where you can look about this more in the tutorial. So the aims of today will be to train a linear neural network on a task that I'm about to tell you about in these 2 different regimes, the task-specific and task-agnostic regimes. Then we're going to compare the representational geometries of these regimes within a task. and link these geometries to their ability to generalize downstream. And at the very end of the tutorial, I want to come back and show you these patterns in human data and show that people form similar representations that come with complementary benefits. So rather than thinking of some people as better than others, they're better at different parts of the task. So that was quite quick, but I'm going to show you a human task, which isn't, unfortunately, is much more complex than the settings we've looked at so far, because it was designed to test this continual learning. So just bear with me for a minute, and please feel free to ask any questions, because this is the core for what we're about to learn. So this is what people did. So people were plant taxonomists on this alien planet. So they were asked to map these plants onto locations around the planet by pulling this dial. And you can see that a single plant is just mapped by moving that dial. And immediately afterwards, they'd learn by trial and error where the correct location for that plant was. And after they're probed on one feature, which is their location in summer, you can think of that as like has wings or flies, they were then probed on the second feature, which is where it grows in winter. And again, they were immediately given feedback. And so people learned about 6 different plants on this planet. And for every plant, it was associated with a completely different feature one, a completely different location in summer. But for winter, there was a fixed, generalizable rule, a pattern that told you how far away winter would be from summer. So in this example, it might be 120 degrees, always clockwise in that way. And so you can see that for people approaching this task, there'd already be different ways in which you could solve it. So one would be just to memorize the association between every plant and its 2 locations, one after another, in a way that didn't spot the rule. And another would be to first learn the plant and its association, and then apply this generalizable rule. And so that's the key intuition I want you to get, is that there are these different ways you can imagine even people learning this task that might map onto different forms of representational solutions. So I'm going to go to the notebook now, because I realized that there might still be issues with Wi-Fi. So I had been thinking that I'd let people work through this on their own, but instead I might do it at the same time, and then feel free to just kind of move along with me, and I'll give you a few seconds to run the simulations. So what we're going to do is train this neural network on the task. And neural networks are trained in exactly the same way that people learn the task. That is, one at a time, given the plant inputs and having to emit either the season of summer or winter. And you can see that what we did, as Lukas mentioned earlier, instead of giving them the plant images, we give the inputs as one-hot vectors. That is, zeros everywhere and a one-hot in one orthogonal location for each input stimulus. And then for the output, rather than training on the exact location, we're training on the cosine and sine of each angle. And if you want to know more why, there's a bit more information in the tutorial. Okay, so now we can already see that there are these different forms of weight initialization. So what we're going to be changing at the moment, across the networks, everything will stay identical except for the initial variance from the input layer into the hidden layer. Are there any questions, by the way, about this task or setting before we go on? Makes sense? Great. Okay, so if I press run here on this slider, you'll see what I'm changing is just the standard deviation of those initial weights. So whether or not they're drawn to be small at the beginning or drawn large at initialization. And so if I run in a very small regime, you can see this is what learning looks like. So on the left here, I'm plotting the loss over time as the network learns. And on the right, you can see the hidden layer geometry. And what you can see is that the network is already learning to represent the relationships between the stimuli. So that is, opposite the circle in navy blue, you can see that they represent this as dissimilar, and nearer by in the circle, it's more similar. So they're learning the circular structure of how to map the plants onto the location. On the other hand, if I move a little bit further up, you can see that the dynamics of the network really change. So it takes fewer trials to learn, and you can see that the loss curve looks quite different, so it's an exponential loss curve. But most importantly, you can see that the representation, again, is very different from what it was before. That is, every plant is dissimilar from every other plant in the way that we described kind of a splitter-style representation to be. And importantly, this will happen, and on all of these networks, they are training to convergence. That is, they are able to achieve an accuracy of 1. So you can see at the bottom, they're performing the task perfectly. But instead, what we see is that these hidden layers are reflecting these very different representational solutions. Okay, brilliant. Any questions on that, or people want more time? It's great. Cool. Right, so now let's go further and think about how we might be able to visualize this beyond the RDMs and instead think of it as the geometry itself. So to do this, what we're going to do is compute PCA, so principal component analysis, on that hidden representation and look at how those 6 different stimuli are represented. And so let me see if this works. Yes, it does. Brilliant. So what I'm plotting here on the left during training is how many principal components are needed to capture that variance in the hidden layer. And what you can see is that in a very rich domain, only 2 hidden components are needed by the end, which reflect a sine and a cosine component for every stimulus. And on the right, you can see that when we actually plot those 6 stimuli in that hidden layer representation, they form a circle. So they've really sorted these stimuli onto the circle in that way. If I move a little bit further along, so into a much lazier regime, I won't go that far. Here we go. You'll see that it starts to get, you start to get slightly more high dimensional as you go. So the actual solution looks slightly less perfect circle. I didn't go quite far enough. And also on the left, more principal components are needed. So you get this higher dimensional solution. And finally, if I go all the way to the other extreme, I'm running this, and you can see that the weights, the representation is hardly changing at all. In fact, it's not changing at all. And this is because when you initialize with very small weights, sorry, very large weights, all of that change is happening in the readout layer, and instead we're getting these static, idiosyncratic representations of those stimuli where none of that relational structure is preserved. In a sense, they are all independent of each other. And you'll see as well that if I click a new seed for a new random initialization and I run it, it will change every single time. So it's just the representation is just reflecting the idiosyncratic inputs, even though the task is converging perfectly in its learning. Okay, so if we were to do just this in humans, we might see everyone performing perfectly well, but we wouldn't be able to tell which representational scheme they're in. So I want to give you an example of one metric which would tell these different representations apart in terms of a downstream affordance. Okay, so one variation of the task we can do is to introduce the requirement to generalize. So out of these 6 stimuli, we now make it the case that for one stimulus, people are shown summer, but they're never given any feedback on winter. That is, the only way that they'll be able to learn winter is by applying this generalizable rule that they've learnt across all of those other stimuli. So in a sense, what it's testing is your ability to infer from a single bit of data what the other properties of the stimulus are based on everything else you know. So it requires a structured representation of the task. And for this, I'm just going to run this sweep, which takes, should take about 10 to 20 seconds. So what I'm doing here is running at all these initializations from very rich, so very small initial weights, to very large initial weights. And what I'm going to plot is the generalization accuracy. And generalization accuracy is the accuracy for that held out piece of data. So that is the true winter location of that test stimulus. And it will be 0 is completely the opposite. 0.5 will be at chance, and 1 is a perfect response. Okay, and you can see that on the left here, generalization accuracy drops as a function of changing from small initial weights to large initial weights, so as a function of what the representation is. So at the beginning, you can see that it's generalizing perfectly because it's learnt this shared structure. And you can see that what's happening is it's mapping the test stimulus perfectly onto the circle in a way that allows the held out piece of information, that is the winter response, to be inferred in just the same way that it does for all the other stimuli. But if I go all the way, if I run through this figure all the way until the weights are very large, you can see that the representation becomes more and more idiosyncratic, and for that reason, it's unable to actually generalize to that held-out stimulus. And one thing you'll notice as well is that the standard deviation across all of our runs, we ran this across 10 iterations, is much higher. So that means that you might get some networks that are generalizing just by chance because of the location of the weights, but overall, the mean across all of them is 0.5. That is, they're completely at chance overall. Okay, brilliant. How am I doing? Yes, I'm doing all right for time. This means I can show you the last part, which is linking this all back to human data. Okay, so I mentioned before that this task actually gets a lot more complicated. It's a continual learning task, and that's what it was designed to measure. And so what I can show you now is a whole host of other downstream affordances that I haven't told you about yet, based on different things we can measure later. So this is what you've learned so far. That is the part of the task where people learn a rule across these 6 different stimuli. But after that, we trained people on a second task, which is learning a species B, which is 6 completely new stimuli, for which there is a second rule that is similar but not identical to that first. So we can think of this as transfer, that is, you should be able to learn the rule faster, but also at the cost of potentially interfering with memory of that first task. So this is the second part. And then finally, at the very end, we asked people to go back to those very first stimuli and do the task again. And the reason we were interested in this was we wanted to test whether learning that intermediate task was going to interfere with their memory of the first task, of that first set of plants. And so here are the different downstream affordances I'm about to show you. So generalization to the test stimulus, and we saw in neural networks that you need a task-specific representation in order to generalize across within a task. Transfer to a similar task, and again, I'm going to show you this in neural networks and people, but this is how their accuracy at the very beginning of learning that second task, so how quickly they can learn about these new stimuli with a similar rule. And finally, we can look at interference across tasks, and the way we measure this is whether, when we go to the very end, whether the networks and people are using rule A or rule B for that first set. And the right answer is that they should be using rule A. These are the stimuli that haven't changed. But some people might end up moving over to using rule B by accident. Okay, so let me start by showing you just in networks. So this is just a schematic, a figure of what we did in the tutorial already, which is the generalization accuracy for the task-agnostic representation, which is about at chance, 0.5, versus the task-specific one, which is able to generalize to that test stimulus. And you can see, again, that there's a much more variable response from the task-agnostic representation because it really is just depending on that idiosyncratic activity in the initialization. Okay, what about transfer to a similar task? So here again, the task-specific representation is able to have better initial performance at this second task because that task is sufficiently similar. And you can look at the paper for examples where the tasks are dissimilar, but this is really where having a task-specific representation helps. But finally, if you look at interference, which is how much overwriting you get, you can see that what happens is that that task-specific representation has fully adapted to that second task by reusing it. in a way that the task-agnostic representation is able to maintain this more separate, splitting-like representation, where it can maintain rule A rather than getting interference. And so in this metric, the task-agnostic representation is actually performing better than the task-specific one. Okay, so one thing that we noticed straight away when we did this task in humans is that there's a really interesting bimodal split that is very similar to what you see here. That is, about half of people, when you go back to the initial task, have had complete interference from that medium one. That is, they've updated. And other half of people are able to go back to that first task and maintain rule A without getting interference. And so if these really are reflecting different kinds of representations, you might expect these to come with a whole set of other affordances in the way that we showed with the representations. So if we look at the initial species B, we actually find the same thing happens as in the networks. That is, the lumpers who've generalized across the tasks are able to learn that similar task faster, whereas the splitters who are separating everything are slower at learning that new task. And also, if we look at generalization accuracy at the very beginning, the lumpers from the beginning were better at using that rule and generalizing than the splitters who were potentially memorizing everything separately. So we can follow how a representation behaves across lots of different settings by separating these different affordances. So whether that's generalization within a learning setting, whether that's transfer to a secondary task, or whether that's interference across tasks, these different families of representations might make different predictions. But we need to test all of them in people to be able to make any claims about this. So just to finish up, there is no single privileged representation for a given task. And this now has two meanings. So in one sense, there are many, many different representations that perform the same function, and we've seen that in both Lukas and Marvin's tutorial. But in a second case, there's no single privileged representation because different representations nor families might bring different affordances, but there are trade-offs between them. So in this case, there are trade-offs between being able to generalize and being able to avoid interference. These different families of representations can bring these complementary benefits in downstream affordances, but we need to be able to test all of these different things to be able to make any actual claims about the representations. And finally, I think something I'm particularly excited about is this idea that individual differences in cognition that might not come out if we just test a single setting can be linked to these different families of representations by these affordances. But again, this requires thinking carefully about the predictions that representations make and testing those in the right settings. That was all I had. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating. I know that was a lot. We have the notebooks, so you can come back. Most of them are written out nicely. We'll maybe add even a little bit more information over the next couple weeks. And yeah, we would love to hear from you, what you think. And yeah, thank you. I don't know if you have anything else to say.
Yeah, like if you have a question for Ellie or for all of us.
We're in time. We still can.
I think we have 1 minute officially and maybe 6 minutes unofficially.
Okay, got it. Okay. Yeah, this is kind of a meta question, but when thinking about lumpers and hair splitters, when thinking about individual differences, should we lump or split lumpers and hair splitters? Does that make sense?
Wait, how should we lump them?
Yeah.
Like, is it one or the other, or is it?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so even for privileged representations, like we made really precise, or Lukas and Marvin made really precise in their tutorials, that still is like a family. So there are many implementation level solutions to that have certain behaviors. So there is multiplicity there as well. So it's almost like when you think about a privileged representation, what we're more talking about is a privileged representational geometry. And there are still many implementations of that privileged representational geometry. Don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Great.
So I'm just trying to piece together the two parts of the tutorial. So the one with the sort of the AI and these artificial neural networks and the psychology aspect, right? So I
Maybe
guess,
could everybody else quiet down with talking, just so we can hear the questioner?
so I'm trying to piece together the two parts of the tutorial. So I think maybe one concern I have is whether sort of the analysis with artificial neural network, if you analyze sort of simple neural networks, this analysis wouldn't sort of generalize to the representational, I guess you call it plurality, that exists in sort of more complex systems like human brains and also the LLMs, right? And on the psychology side, it feels like maybe it's sort of well known that people do have different representations of the world, different world models and different abstractions, right? Although sometimes maybe we don't study this in the experiments enough, these individual differences in representations. So I do wonder what we gain by also analyzing these artificial neural networks alongside these psychology sort of experiments. And sorry, so the last component of the question, I wonder about sort of the Mars levels here, right? So the first part of the presentation, it was about the degeneracy at sort of the implementational level, right? So these neurons can add extra neurons, or maybe the neurons can be interchanged or something like this. And then the second part of the presentation seemed to be degeneracy at sort of the algorithmic level, right? So there's these presentations at the algorithmic level. So how do you like mesh these two views from the first and second part of the presentation?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I think this kind of points back where we were talking about the neat, messy kind of continuum. Like, the brain is inherently messy, so it's hard to understand. But if we go to this very neat model class, we can actually start to analytically disambiguate and understand those things. I think intuitively, if you just collect data and look at data, we may be lucky to find a thing like lumpers and splitters. But I think one of the main reasons why we were able to find this differentiation was because we used linear neural networks, we ran those simulations, we saw these differences, and a lot of this work has been done before we even did the experiments. And like, for example, that we did held out that one winter location was exactly because we had this intuition that those representations can be different. And I agree with you that in psychology and human behavior more generally, and also in like neuroscience, like animal behavior, it's very well known that there can be different strategies that emerge, but often they would be differentiated in different behavior. Like you would do your decision differently. And so I think what's really interesting is that you can do kind of the same performance, can kind of this, from the outside they look identical, but actually what's happening inside, it's very different. And I think only by looking, especially analytically, at those different parts and ways how you can solve things, you can start to look for the patterns in the data that you're collecting. So I see them really just to inform your intuition and like falsify your intuition that maybe similar function does not imply similar representation. And to the second part.
Can I add one? Or is
I was going to answer the second part, but do you want to?
Can I add one thing to the first one? Yeah. So one other thing to the behavior point is that often when you study individual differences in behavior, at least in computational cognitive settings, all that you get is a difference in something like accuracy or performance, rather than trade-offs where people, some people might perform better than others. And I think especially if we're looking at computational approaches to studying individual differences, for example, with relevance to computational psychiatry, we really want to understand why people might come with a strategy because it's helpful in other areas. So why a particular representation might be helpful in a completely different setting. And so I think that the use of these analytical tools can help you understand normatively where a representation helps elsewhere in a way that makes us actually look for it in human behavior, rather than just having tasks where, some people do better than others. Does that make sense at all? Yeah.
Yeah. At the risk of adding to this, but in response to your long question, on the first point, to add to Lukas and Ellie's points, I'm a epistemic optimist, where I think we are making progress to try to understand some of the details of neural networks that matter for how they behave, how they learn, and these sorts of things. So I think, for example, this task-specific, task-agnostic distinction shows up in machine learning as a rich, lazy distinction. And that's something that people are working to understand in large-scale neural networks, not just the simple ones that we saw here. And then on your point on Mars levels of analysis, I think your point was about why does it matter that there are implementational level details that differ if what we care about is behavior in the end?
Oh, sorry, I meant there's degeneracy at both implementational level and algorithmic level, right? So
yes, there's cascades of degeneracy. So Marvin gave an example of two functional solutions which differ in their sort of decision surfaces, but solve the same task. So those you can see as sort of algorithmic level different algorithms to solve the same problem if the problem is posed as just the task. And then further, there are implementation level differences. I'm not sure that answered your question.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering whether what we learn about the implementational level degeneracies could actually transfer or like tell us anything about the higher level, if you want to call them more algorithmic level degeneracies.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. In the keynote, we discussed a bit this idea of whether these degeneracies are nuisance or normative. And that's a question about what details matter at the lower level of analysis. So to explain how the bottom-up solutions give rise to some structure at the top level is an explanation that requires you to cross levels of analysis and requires you to abstract some details and keep others. So that work is important work. Some of the details will matter, some of them won't. And this isn't an answer to your question, it's more a meta-scientific stance, but I think like that is a really interesting question. What details matter?
This is mostly for Ellie. So I couldn't help but notice in data that some people seem to do well across all three tasks. And I mean, maybe you're going towards this, but could you hold a sort of a larger representation and project onto either lumping or splitting? I'm assuming this is where you were going, that you can then, based on that, you do a hypothesis test, based on the result, then you project whatever your higher representation is that's not committed to lumping or splitting, and then you go on that. I mean, I'm sure you've talked about that, but I wanted to hear what you think.
Yes. Very keen eyes. I mean, so you're right. There's sort of a third form of representation for this task that actually would be the best one in this case that very few people have, which is being able to know that there are two separate tasks with similar rules that are different. So orthogonalize the two tasks, but learn the separate rules. And it's a very small set of people who have them, and I think you're right, that would look like a different representational solution. I think the question is when you get, in a sense, you have to still decide which set of representations to use, and most of the case, when it's subtle enough, you don't know as the experimenter, you don't know as the participant which one is right from the experimenter's perspective. So I think you're right, there is a third case smaller than both the other groups. And I think the question of like there being a single one was sort of more linked to something that Lukas said, which is when you're in, for example, a setting where you're having to generalize, you're going to make errors if you have a lumpy representation. So you're going to think that a penguin can fly if you're a child who's learning to generalize. And that's not because you're making a mistake, that's because that kind of representation is what you should use in that setting. So I think it's, again, these trade-offs between what you're going to see later on.
So I think I have to stop this session now. But let's thank our speakers again. And,
thank you so much.
Hope to see a lot of you at the distributed bar crawl.